St. Julian's Church was already 50 years old when Norsemen sailed into Norwich in the year 1004. The scribe of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle wrote, "In this year came Sweyn with his fleet to Norwich, sacked the borough and burnt it to the ground." Locals eventually rebuilt the little timber church, digging into the chalk hills to quarry flint. This time they built a church with a tower and a bell to call people to prayer. And they built to last. The walls of the tower are 4 feet thick. It was built so strongly that the base of the tower is still there today, 1,000 years later, in spite of a direct hit by a wartime bomb. In 1066, invaders once more sailed up the river into Norwich, the Norman conquerors. But they came to build, not to burn. The Normans built 3 new churches in Norwich and rebuilt nearly 30 old ones before they made a start on their new cathedral. The archway in the south porch shows St. Julian's could be one of them. But local flint wasn't grand enough for the Normans when it came to building their new cathedral. They brought in honey-coloured stone from Normandy, shipload after shipload of it. Much of it was already cut to shape before it was put on board. It saved stowage on the ships and made building speedier once it arrived. Waterways were highways before the days of roads and railways, and Norwich had easy access to the ports of the Low Countries, and to the rivers beyond them across the whole of Europe. Bales of prized Norfolk woolens were shipped out, Flemish lace and German wine came in return. The wealth of the city's merchants is evident in his mansion, close by St. Julian's, built by a mayor of Norwich as his house and showroom. It fell into disrepair as the years went by, and for centuries the outside gave no hint of the grandeur within. It took 1,000 English oaks to build this great house. The wyverns called on the rafters give the house its present name of Dragon Hall. But the ships that brought wealth brought with them rats that carried the plague, and in 1349 the peaceful and prosperous city was ravaged by the Black Death. Soon the churchyards could hold no more corpses. Carts were pushed through the streets with the cry of "Bring out your dead!" and bodies were tipped into common graves. Julian of Norwich survived the plague that raged when she was a child of 6, and lived through 2 more when she was 19 and 26. When she was over 30, she became an anchoress at St. Julian's, and she was in her 70s when Marjorie Kemp, the troubled visionary from King's Lynn, visited her to ask her advice. A new bell was installed in the tower later that century. It's called Gabriel, and has the inscription, "Ave Maria, gratia plena, Hail Mary, full of grace." The same bell still rings at St. Julian's today. The bell was lucky to survive a century later, when Henry VIII declared himself head of the English Church and seized its possessions. The new owner of nearby Carrow Abbey, Sir John Shelton, stripped the lead from the abbey roof and then sold the bells and the lead for £145. Carrow Abbey had appointed the priest at St. Julian's for 500 years, but for the next 45 years no priest was named. Gawain Brown, appointed in 1581, was chosen by Sir John Shelton's widow. 100 years later, there was yet another devastating plague, the Great Plague of 1665. There were 151 burials in St. Julian's churchyard during July and August that year, so many that the bodies had to be buried in trenches, and there was no time for Gabriel to be rung as their passing bell. This engraving in 1741 shows St. Julian's round tower at the heart of the busy port of Norwich. Its bell rang out above the clatter of ships unloading, carts rattling on the cobbles, and housewives bargaining for fish. It was heard above the babble of tongues in the alehouses as seamen gambled and swore in all the languages of their home ports. The mansions of the rich and the hovels of the poor stand side by side. The Duke of Norfolk has built a palace where a monastery once stood in King Street. There are pleasure craft on the river now, as well as cargo boats. 100 years later, St. Julian's looks picturesque in this engraving, but the reality is very different. For 15 years, from 1800 to 1850, Stephen Webster and his son after him were rectors. They neglected the church, and Julian's became so dilapidated that no services were being held there, and there was a proposal to pull it down. The moulding of this Norman archway was in good repair in 1818, when John Sell Cotman made this drawing. But 17 years later it was reported, "The outer moulding is entirely gone. It is difficult to ascertain what the second has been, and only a small portion of the inner moulding is perfect." The Gothic east window had fallen out and had been replaced by a small, cheap window, and even that is partly boarded up. But the Websters were forced to undertake major repairs in 1845, when on the 19th of April the Norfolk Chronicle reported, "On Monday morning last, about 8 o'clock, the end of the chancel of St. Julian's Church fell in, and the noise greatly alarmed the neighbours. There has been a crack in the chancel wall for the last 10 years. A subscription list was opened, and a sixpenny rate was levied on the parishioners. Sixpence might not sound a lot of money, but a labourer's wage for a 60-hour week was 4 shillings, 8 sixpences. Rent would take half, leaving only 4 sixpences for everything else. But the sum of £516 was eventually raised. The end wall was rebuilt, and the thatched roof of the chancel was replaced by pantiles. A Victorian Gothic window was installed. But some of the work was drastic to the point of vandalism. The tower had 6 feet lopped off its height, and the Norman archway was simply plastered over. The medieval screen was demolished when box pews like these were stripped out. The wall paintings were whitewashed over, and all the memorials were removed. But, unnoticed by the Websters, momentous changes had been taken place in the Church of England during their 50-year incumbency. The Tracts for the Times, published by John Newman and his colleagues in the 1830s and 40s, had ushered in the Oxford movement, which inspired a new generation of priests. The music and colour of their liturgy, together with their pastoral care, began to attract large congregations. The establishment was alarmed by the success, and frequently incited them to slum parishes with crumbling churches to try to deter them. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Archibald Tait, was determined to put a stop to what he saw as this creeping Roman Catholicism, and in 1874 he introduced his own private members' bill in Parliament. Making the sign of the cross became illegal, and so were vestments, processions, incense, lighted candles on the altar, and the elevation of the host. The magazine Punch had fun at the Archbishop's expense, as it viewed him desperately trying to control the black sheep of his rebellious flock, for fear they might escape to Rome. But it was no laughing matter for the priests. 5 of them were arrested and sent to prison. Priests like these took on a formidable task in these desperately poor parishes. By now, Dragon Hall had been divided up, and housed more than 150 people, with whole families living in one room. Part of it had become the Old Barge Inn. Many of the other abandoned mansions had been taken over by landlords who did nothing in the way of repairs, subdivided them and rented them out. A yard like this in King Street might house anything up to 40 families. They shared communal privies and a single pump. In 1897, the Norwich Mercury wrote, "An open channel runs in front of the houses, containing sewage, slops, and rainwater. The smell is neither imaginable nor describable. Rats were also seen." The priest's task was all the harder because in 1851 less than 50% of the population were churchgoers, according to the National Census of Religious Worship. And parishioners had other ways to spend their meagre wages. In 1850, sixpence would buy nearly a litre of gin, or a gallon and a half of beer, and there were 24 pubs in King Street. When Edward Ram arrived at nearby St. John, Timber Hill, in 1871, the church was in such a bad way that, for safety's sake, service were held under the west gallery in case the roof fell in. The tower had collapsed long since, and the bells sold to pay for the repairs. But Edward Ram was fortunate enough to find a wealthy member of the congregation, who paid for the church to be repaired and completely reordered. There was no such benefactor at St. Julian's. Even so, when William Cant arrived in 1868, he set about reordering the church to reflect the new style of worship. He had a new screen made to replace the medieval screen demolished earlier. He paved the church with encaustic tiles and raised the level of the chancel floor. He replaced the pews with benches, and he seems to have paid for much or all of it out of his own pocket. But one member of the congregation had enough money to help him. In 1868, Maria Baxter's brother died, only 34, leaving her the only member of the family. He and their father had both been churchwardens, and Maria paid to have the east window reglazed in stained glass in memory of him and their parents. It showed Christ in the centre panel, with Lady Julian on one side and St. Stephen on the other. After 500 years, Julian was remembered in her own church. But Julian had been forgotten. Her cell had been pulled down, and the Bishop of Worcester, reviewing her book when it was first put into print in 1670, had dismissed it as the blasphemous and senseless tittle-tattle of this hysterical gossip. And after that it disappeared for 2 centuries. But in 1843 her book was rescued from obscurity when this first edition was reprinted by an Anglican clergyman, George Hargreave Parker, and Maria Baxter must have seen a copy. Back then, copies of Julian's book were hard to come by. 50 years later, in 1895, one correspondent to the East Daily Press said that he had been unable to obtain any one of them in Norwich, in spite of the fact that since been 2 further editions. Another correspondent, Mary Ann Barnes, wrote she had a copy of the 1877 edition, given me by the rector William Cant, under whom I served as organist for many years. It seems unlikely he would have given it to her unless he had copies of other editions. But it was too late to ask him, for by 1895 the rector was missing. William Cant seemed to have paid for nearly all the work to the church since arriving over 20 years before. But by 1890 he'd had enough. He drew the attention of the vestry to the large sum of money which he'd advanced, and declared, "I refuse to do so any more unless a church rate is established for keeping the fabric and the church in good order." When no church rate was voted, he walked out. The alarmed churchwarden sent word to the Bishop of Norwich, John Sheepshank, but he took no action, and the vestry meeting was held in the rector's absence for the next 5 years. At last, in February 1895, the bishop issued a letter of admonition. The following year, William Cant was sequestered, deprived of his office and stipend. His curate was appointed in his place. Copies of Julian's book were few and far between when William Cant walked out, but in 1901 a new edition of Revelations of Divine Love was published, edited by Grace Warwick. The Norwich Evening News reported this and recalled how difficult it had been to lay hands on a copy 6 years earlier. But by the time Johnston Murray became rector in 1903, every member of the congregation could easily get hold of a copy of Julian's book, and would see an image of her in the east window Sunday by Sunday. In 1906, 3 years after he arrived, Johnston Murray went exploring in the south of the churchyard, and uncovered stonework he believed could have been the foundations of an anchorite cell. and that same year the church acquired another image of Julian when Maria Baxter died, and a stained glass window in her memory was installed in the south wall of the chancel. It showed Julian of Norwich holding a book and St. Julian of Le Mans, the patron saint of the church. This is the only known record of the window, which was shattered when the church was bombed. Julian was told, "If God wills to show you more, he will be your light," and the translation of the Latin scroll reads, "Look to God and be given light." In 1901 there was great excitement when a copy of the short text turned up at a book sale, having been missing for centuries. It gives her a name and a place. "There is a vision showed by the goodness of God to a devout woman, and her name is Julian, who is recluse at Norwich, and is yet in life, Anno Domini 1413. By this time the furnishing of St. Julian's, with its statue of Our Lady, reserved sacrament, and the use of incense proclaimed on the screen, is no longer illegal, but there were no more prosecutions after the scandal of the imprisoned priests, and the right to diversity in worship was recognized in 1906. But the free-spending William Cant had used his money mainly for improvements, not for maintenance, and by 1904 the tower had become so dangerous the bell ringer said he went in fear of his life. Paul Raybould succeeded Johnston Murray in 1925, and his Beretta leaves no doubt about his kind of churchmanship. He continued the struggle to find money to keep the church in good repair, and he managed to find enough to create a Julian memorial. It was attached to the south wall of the chancel, just below the window picturing Julian of Norwich. It was probably dedicated in 1930, on what was then believed to be the 500th anniversary of her death. 2 years later, Norwich Cathedral acknowledged Julian when she featured in a stained glass window there. This time it showed her with a cat. By 1934, when this photograph was taken, the church was in good hands and in good repair, and looked as if it would stand for centuries. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 was to change all that. This was the sight that greeted Paul Raybould on the 27th of June 1942. St. Julian's was a heap of rubble. The bomb had dropped directly into the tower, but the 4-foot-thick walls had contained the blast. Things they could have been a lot worse, locals said. The church, that saved St. Julian's Alley. And this aerial photograph shows the surrounding houses and the school next door are almost undamaged. Priests and people began to dig to save what they could. They unearthed the Julian memorial under rubble sparkling with glass from the shattered windows. And deep in the wreckage, Paul Raybould discovered the tabernacle with the Blessed Sacrament safe inside. They found the bell Gabriel, cracked by its fall from the tower. Over the next week they managed to dig out the alms dish, the processional cross, the brass missal stand, the sanctuary lamp, some candlesticks, and 3 sets of vestments. They found the reredos almost undamaged. The whole of Norwich was badly damaged during the Second World War, mainly in the 3 Blitzkrieg air raids in 1942. One of the city's mainline railway stations was destroyed. The shopping centre was devastated, and roads were impassable. Street after street of houses were made uninhabitable. Many of the city's factories were damaged or destroyed. Rebuilding was urgent, and restoring medieval churches was low on the list. The fact that Norwich had so many of them counted against them. With 33 medieval churches still remaining, the loss of 4 of them was the least of the city's worries. 3 other medieval churches were bombed in the Blitz, but they were never restored, even though they were not as badly damaged as St. Julian's. But Paul Raybould was determined that St. Julian's should be rebuilt, and he had resolute allies. The community of All Hallows Ditchingham had been undaunted by the squalor of the Norwich slums a century before, and, true to the spirit of their foundress, they resolved to tackle the spiritual poverty of the 20th century as they had the material poverty of the past. We hope to rebuild Mother Julian's cell and to erect a mission house adjoining the church. We need the witness and work of the religious life in our cities today. We shall need £8,000, they calmly announced. Their appeal was in Julian's name. Your help is needed to restore the shrine of Lady Julian, to renew her message to the world, their poster said. The money came in. 10 years later, St. Julian's was already rising from the ruins, and on the south of the church, an anchorite cell is taking place, with a doorway linking it to the church. A Norman archway, similar to the original, was salvaged from a nearby bombed church and became the entrance to the cell. At the centre of the arch is a tiny cross and a rooster, symbol of the resurrection. Paul Raybould was able to keep a day-to-day watch on the building work because St. Julian's Rectory had now moved to rooms in the old Dragon Hall. But he did not live to see the work complete, and his successor was rector when St. Julian's, complete with the anchorite cell, was rededicated on the 8th of May 1953. The whole of the community of All Hallows was there to rejoice. It was 100 years since the community had been founded. The Norwich-based sisters moved into their newly built house in St. Julian's Alley, and the cell became their chapel, filled from the start with daily prayer. St. Julian's parish had been a crowded and bustling community before the war. The school was next door to the churchyard. Horse-drawn brewers' drays clattered along the streets, and the smell of hops and malted barley filled the air. The people who lived in the close-packed terraced houses worked locally, many of them at the two breweries. They spent their money in the little local shops, and they met in the pubs. It was a place where children played in the streets, and neighbours knew who they were and kept an eye out for them. But the bombing had torn gaps in many of the terraces, and there were still old houses in need of demolition or costly repair. Faced with the problems of wartime bombing and pre-war neglect, the City Council embarked on a major clearance programme. This 1958 map shows a new highway, Rouen Road, is to be driven through the heart of the parish. The shaded areas are to be demolished. The church and the two breweries are almost the only substantial buildings to be left standing. If St. Julian's had not been restored, it would have been wiped off the map. The bulldozers finished the demolition the bombs had begun. With the site cleared, building work went ahead rapidly, and little by little some of the displaced parishioners were able to move back. But the parish was changing out of recognition. Both of the breweries had been badly damaged in the Blitz, and neither recovered. One of them closed, and the other was taken over by the London brewers, Watney's. Their new brewing method needed more land. The sisters' newly built mission house stood where they needed it, and they made an offer. In a bold decision, the community sold them the house, and with the proceeds built a much larger guest house next door to the church, together with a meeting hall to go with it. The celebration of the 600th anniversary of Julian of Norwich in Norwich Cathedral in 1973 saw the guest house filled to overflowing. The inspiration for that celebration came from 3 enclosed sisters who'd been professed on the 8th of May. They reminded their chaplain of the anniversary, and he alerted the Dean of Norwich. Alan Webster sent out invitations to a Eucharist. People who knew and loved Julian came from all over the world. But it was the decisions of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s that made St. Julian's 600th anniversary so memorable. It was possible for Christians of all denominations to pray together in Norwich Cathedral for the first time in 400 years. The following year, St. Julian's had a new rector, Michael MacLean. He believed the anchorite cell should have an anchorite, and he asked retired priest Robert Llewellyn to come and be a praying presence in the cell. Father Robert moved into a tiny flat across the road from St. Julian's and would spend most of his day in the cell. People began to seek him out as they had Julian. Sometimes it was scholars. Sometimes it was Irish girls working the streets who drifted into the church and found him there praying the rosary. Over the years he compiled a book of daily readings from Julian so that people could come to know her book little by little. Enfolded in Love was published on the 8th of May, 1980. It proved so popular it had to be reprinted twice the same year, and it's still selling fast today. As more pilgrims began to seek out the church, the Friends of Julian of Norwich was formed, and looked round for a place to welcome them. Once more, the community of All Hallows provided the means. They leased their hall to the Friends to become the Julian Centre. The rent was a hazelnut, paid each year on the 8th of May. Rebuilding the tower to its full height had always proved too costly, but in the 1990s, new welding methods meant the crack in the fallen bell could be repaired. The tower was built up a few feet to form a bell cote, and in January 1993 the newly mended bell was hoisted into position after a silence of 50 years. Today the bell rings out as it has done for centuries, announcing Gabriel's "Hail Mary, full of grace," and Mary's reply, "Behold God's handmaid." But the bell rings out across a very different parish. When almost all of the medieval churches in Norwich were deconsecrated in the 1980s, St. John, Timber Hill and St. Julian's were among the few of those retained for worship. The far side of the river is now part of the parish, and today St. John the Baptist, Timber Hill with St. Julian's is the largest in the city centre. The sprawling parish is as much of a mixture as it was in Julian's day. There are schools and supermarkets, pubs and clubs, greasy spoon cafes and fine dining. A walk round the bounds of the parish is a 4-mile trek. It takes in both the railway station and the football stadium. Scuffles break out as rival fans pour out of the station when Norwich City is playing at home. Extra police are on duty and watch for drugs. A new footbridge links the parish on both sides of the river. It's called the Lady Julian Bridge, a name that came top of the poll in an open competition. The name was suggested by Sisters of the Community of All Hallows, who joined the Mayor of Norwich on the opening day. The river, once a highway, is now seen as a pleasant place to live, and the derelict factories that line its banks are finding a new life as they're converted into fashionable flats. Luxury apartments and social housing rub shoulders, and as more people move into the parish week by week, a new sense of community is developing. Julian, once forgotten, is now a familiar figure in that community, her name known even by people who've never visited the church or read her book. She keeps watch, courtesy of a graffiti artist who has painted her larger-than-life image on a wall. Within the church is a community that has no boundaries in time and place. T.S. Eliot wrote, "If you came this way, taking any route, starting from anywhere, at any time or at any season, it would always be the same. You would have to put off sense and notion. You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, inform curiosity, or carry report. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. Here the intersection of the timeless moment is England and nowhere, never and always. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, by the purification of the motive in the ground of our beseeching."